What does power really look like? Is it a crown resting on a king's head or the silent weight of gold in a banker's vault? In the 14th century, Europe trembled. Plague, famine, endless wars, everything sacred seemed fragile. Yet, in the city of Florence, a different kind of revolution was taking shape. Not one fought with swords, but with numbers, credit, and faith itself. And in the center of that quiet storm stood one family, the Medici. They weren't warriors. They weren't born into nobility. They were merchants, bankers. How does a merchant become more powerful than a monarch? How does one family write their name across the pages of 3 centuries of history? Giovanni di Medici understood something his rivals didn't. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, he saw that money could rewrite lineage. He built his fortune carefully, slowly. He lent to merchants, to nobles, to bishops. And then, the greatest customer of all came knocking, the church itself. The Vatican needed gold, needed bankers it could trust, and Giovanni offered his services with humility and precision. Soon the Pope's treasury flowed through Medici hands. It's strange, isn't it? The Church, moral guardian of Christendom, relying on the invisible power of a Florentine banker. But that's how it worked. Faith might rule men's souls, but credit ruled their lives. The Medici Bank grew like wildfire. Branches appeared in Rome, Venice, London, Bruges. Kings owed them, nobles courted them, and slowly, the family learned the greatest lesson of all: if everyone owes you money, you don't need an army. You already own one. Giovanni's son Cosimo inherited more than wealth. He inherited his father's quiet genius for control. He would later be called Cosimo the Elder, the father of Florence. He didn't fight battles. He won them in silence, through alliances, favors, and loans. He understood that if you build the city's beauty, the city will build your legend. So he poured money into churches and libraries. He paid architects, scholars, sculptors. And Florence began to glow, its skyline crowned by Brunelleschi's dome, its people whispering the Medici name with awe. But was it generosity or strategy? Every artist funded was a loyal voice. Every church he built stood as stone propaganda, proof that the Medici were God's chosen stewards of Florence. Power, however, breeds fear. The Albizzi, Florence's old elite, hated him. To them, Cosimo was a merchant pretending to be prince. In 1433 they arrested him, accused him of treason, locked him away in a tower, and prepared to end his story. Imagine him there, in the dark, hearing the footsteps outside his cell. Did he believe his family's dream was about to die? But money, once again, changed everything. Bribes were paid, allies moved in the shadows, and when the dust settled it was the Albizzi, not Cosimo, who were banished. Cosimo returned to Florence not as a survivor, but as its ruler. Without wearing a crown, he controlled everything that mattered. Under his guidance, Florence became the jewel of Europe. The arts flourished, philosophy awakened, trade exploded. And yet, beneath the marble and music, the foundation was power, one man's ability to make the city dance to his rhythm. By the time Cosimo died in 1464, the Medici were more than a family, they were an idea. The invisible kings of Florence. Their name was whispered in palaces and chapels, feared and envied across the continent. But power never sits still. The higher it climbs, the thinner the air becomes. As the Medici wealth and influence spread through Europe, enemies began to circle. Inside Florence, rivals plotted revenge. Beyond its walls, politics and faith would soon collide in ways that even the bankers of Florence couldn't control. Because when one family commands the gold of kings and the blessing of popes, how long before both start to turn against them? Power never sleeps. It only changes hands. By the mid-1400s, the Medici family were no longer just bankers, they were the heartbeat of Florence. The city glittered with marble, bronze, and ideas. Painters, architects, poets, all of them owed something to the Medici purse. But behind every masterpiece lay a calculation. The family had learned that art could be weaponized. Paintings could soften enemies, buildings could immortalize reputations. Cosimo's legacy didn't end with him. It passed to his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici. History remembers him as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and magnificent he was, charismatic, clever, poetic. He was everything a Renaissance prince was meant to be. But what made Lorenzo so different? Was he just a patron of the arts, or was he the first true architect of influence? He inherited not only the family bank, but also the delicate web of alliances that held Florence together. Under Lorenzo, money became culture, and culture became propaganda. He funded Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and a young sculptor named Michelangelo. Imagine that, the greatest minds of an era working under the shadow of one man's generosity. But was it generosity or control? Because every artist, every poet, every philosopher who flourished in Florence was, in a sense, a reflection of Lorenzo himself. He was crafting not just art, but identity. He made Florence the soul of the Renaissance and himself its beating heart. Outside the city walls, however, envy brewed. The Papal States watched Florence with suspicion. The rival Papacy family, once friends, now plotted in silence. They saw Lorenzo's charisma as arrogance, his diplomacy as dominance. And in 1478, they struck. Picture it Easter Sunday. The cathedral packed. The choir echoes off the stone. Lorenzo stands beside his brother Giuliano during Mass, and then, chaos. Knives flash, screams rise, blood on the marble floor. Giuliano collapses. The Papacy conspiracy has begun. Lorenzo, wounded but alive, locks himself in the sacristy as Florence erupts. Priests flee, bells toll, and the streets fill with mobs shouting for vengeance. Within hours, the conspirators are hunted down and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. Their bodies swing over the crowd. A brutal warning to anyone who might forget who truly ruled this city. It's hard not to wonder, what must have gone through Lorenzo's mind as he looked at them? Triumph, fear, or the realization that power, once stained with blood, can never again be innocent. After that day, Lorenzo's rule became absolute. Florence adored him, feared him, depended on him. He negotiated peace among warring Italian states, turned enemies into allies, and kept the fragile balance of the peninsula intact. But every golden age carries its own cracks. The Medici Bank was faltering, wars drained the treasury. And when Lorenzo died in 1492, the Florentine dream began to flicker. Soon the city fell under the spell of a different voice, the monk Girolamo Savonarola, who thundered against corruption, greed, and the vanity of the Medici world. He called the Renaissance a sin, its art a temptation, its patrons devils in disguise. The people listened. They burned paintings, smashed statues, chanted hymns where once they had praised beauty. Can you imagine what that felt like? The very city the Medici had built now purging itself of everything they stood for. Within a few short years, the family was exiled, their palaces looted, their names spat upon. And yet, the story wasn't over. Because the Medici had learned one unbreakable truth: money and faith, though they often clash, are twins born of power. So while Florence tried to cleanse itself, a new Medici was watching, waiting, planning. One who would trade the banker's table for the papal throne. In the next chapter of this story, we'll see how the family returned, not just to rule Florence again, but to claim the most sacred seat in Christendom itself. They say power never dies, it only changes shape. For the Medici, exile was not an ending, it was an intermission. While Florence tried to forget them, Europe could not. Their allies still owed debts, their names still carried weight, and the Church itself had not finished using them. From this web of influence rose a man who would fuse money and faith into one unstoppable force. Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo's exiled cousin. He returned to Rome not as a banker, but as a cleric, and in 1513 the cardinals did the unthinkable. They elected him Pope Leo X, a Medici pope. Can you imagine the shock? The family that once balanced ledgers in Florence now commanded the keys of heaven itself. What does a banker's son do when he inherits the throne of St. Peter? He spends lavishly. Leo X filled Rome with art and spectacle. He commissioned Raphael to paint the Vatican rooms, Michelangelo to raise St. Peter's Basilica. He wanted the church to embody the glory of God, but also the triumph of the Medici. Yet glory has a price. To fund his vision, Leo X expanded the sale of indulgences, documents promising forgiveness in exchange for coin. The money poured in until a German monk named Martin Luther asked a simple, dangerous question: can salvation really be sold? That question ignited the Reformation, tearing Europe apart and shaking the church to its foundations. And once again, at the center of the storm, the Medici name burned bright and perilous. After Leo came Clement, another Medici pope, who faced a world no longer afraid of questioning authority. When he refused to grant Henry V a divorce, England broke away from Rome. When he angered Emperor Charles V, the German army marched on the Vatican itself. In 1527, Rome was sacked, its churches looted, its people slaughtered. Clement fled, humiliated, the Medici prestige bleeding out in the streets. Was it fate catching up? Or simply the price of climbing too high? Because the higher you reach, the more the world delights in watching you fall. Florence, too, began to crumble. Wars, shifting alliances, and endless intrigue left the city vulnerable. The later Medicis held titles, Grand Dukes, princes, but not the vision or genius of their ancestors. They fought each other, poisoned each other, married for politics, and ruled through fear instead of brilliance. Still, traces of greatness remained. They built galleries that would one day become the Uffizi, filled with treasures the world now calls priceless. They sponsored scientists, navigators, thinkers. Even as the dynasty decayed, its legacy refused to die. By the 18th century, the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, looked upon her family's vast collection of art, jewels, and manuscripts. She knew the line would end with her. What does one do at the end of a dynasty that once owned the Renaissance? She made a final, extraordinary decision. She willed every painting, every statue, every book to the people of Florence, on one condition: nothing could ever leave the city. That single act turned private power into public heritage. Today, tourists stand in the same galleries she saved, staring up at Botticelli's Birth of Venus or Michelangelo's David, unaware that they are witnesses to the last gift of a family that once ruled the world through art, money, and faith. The Medici story is a mirror. It shows us how ambition can build civilizations and destroy them, how beauty can be born from greed, how faith and finance can dance together until neither remembers who is leading. So ask yourself, what would you have done in their place? Would you have turned gold into cathedrals, or cathedrals back into gold? Would you have traded your soul for immortality, knowing that 500 years later, people would still speak your name? Because here we are, still speaking it. The Medici are gone, but their shadow still moves across every museum, every dome, every corner of Florence. If this story moved you, if the ghosts of Florence still whisper in your mind, then stay with us. Subscribe to Unsolved History, join our growing community of history lovers, and help us keep these stories alive. Tell us which dynasty, which forgotten empire, which untold moment of the past you want to uncover next. Your voice keeps history breathing.